In our last reading of Building Dwelling Thinking, I think it's important to make a few observations of my own reading. That in the last reading, it gets a bit confusing. And part of the demonstration is not to confuse, but to demonstrate thinking with the text, thinking out loud. If we approach philosophy with the pretenses to be an expert, if we approach text with the pretensions of the expert, we'll miss things. Even if we don't, we will miss things. The text, in a way, is a very generous place, but also sometimes, depending on the reader and where they're at with the subject matter, impenetrable. But I don't think that, I think it's important that we develop confidence with reading. And so I just need to make that clear. I am not reading a text for some kind of mass consumption. This is the information. This is how you understand it. I'm approaching the text as a reader of philosophy, as someone who has a long-term engagement with Heidegger and other philosophical texts, and that I'm not as I've said before, a Heidegger fanboy, nor am do I have some kind of axe to grind where I try to keep my point. I do have my affiliations in terms of ideas, and that is that where I'm interested at individually, intellectually, is how much of this comes from what other thinkers have demarcated as poetry and poetry as thought. Because in this point in later Heidegger, especially this essay and others in this particular decade of this time period, he has made his turn, and Heidegger's turn is supposedly kicking off in the mid-30s. Okay, so his turn is interesting historically because he is part of the Nazi regime for about a year, and thereafter, where philosophy is not doing or not manifesting in the way that he had thought, that whatever National Socialism was not what was good for his understanding of philosophy in terms of its primacy. And so philosophy at that point, by about 1934, 1935, enters into a kind of destitution, and then in contributions to philosophy in 1936, he begins, the turn begins to happen. What is the turn? The turn is toward poetry. And Heidegger's working with poetry, but as a subject for philosophy. So the convolution that I want to figure out is how he's philosophizing what Wallace Stevens would call the poetry of thought, but that equally that the poetry of thought is at work in other thinkers who are not philosophers in the position that Heidegger is a philosopher historically. Building Dwelling Thinking has many features of this, and it has characterized this relationship to poetry, has characterized continental philosophy in its development. And all of the readers, right, of Heidegger, whether it's Agamben, Nancy, Derrida, Stiegler, Deleuze-Guattari, whoever comes out of this relationship to Heidegger also brings the characterizations of poetry in relationship to Heidegger's philosophy. And so I think it's very important, very crucial actually, that there is some differentiation here in general between philosophy and poetry. So as I had begun to mention, I read Heidegger with an open mind, as open as possible, taking the risk of being convinced about things that I might not want to be convinced about. And sometimes that's a thinking out loud where I'm sorting my thoughts. And the demonstration there is that it's okay to learn with a text. It's okay. But what I want to do by way of a kind of recap is work through some of the situation of the last few pages, namely from about 356 to 360 where we ended. So also to bring back in a few themes. Constancy in shape, which is from Wallace Stevens. Abridgment, which I also bring from Wallace Stevens, as a kind of play between, as you might know by now, that the bridge is really important in Heidegger's illustration and his figure. But then I had mentioned and had worked through in the last, in part 3, the bridge as abridgment, right? The relationship between thinking about the bridge in consciousness as a representation, in mathematics, in the worldly manifold as, numerical things or data or descriptions of dimensions, and then actually what is the relationship to the bridge and its locale, and why can we be somewhere else in our thought besides what we're thinking about. It's a very complicated thing at first, especially if we come at it through content and the literal way, and that's when illustrations and images and experience actually are in conflict with study. So abridgment, constancy, shape, representation and conscious thought. Heidegger's idea on page 358 about how thinking, which runs through these spaces, right? We had paras, right, and the oros, right? So the limit at which numbers then come to situate a space or individuation of something coming into existence. Then that he also says that locales are things too, and he says something else which probably slips by us, and this has to do with the stay among things, and that is where I'm going to work on right now before we get to the last 3 pages. So in general, Heidegger is philosophizing the experiences of the poet through the figure of the bridge, and that when he talks about traversing, thinking about the bridge, or the conscious thoughts about the bridge and the bridge being there, or that we're not thinking about the bridge when we're on the bridge, these are types of abridging movements that it collapses the antinomy or puts us by way of thinking passage in another place, or that we could be in another place. So it brings up this question, well, where are we really, right? Are we entirely in the mind? Are we in some kind of physical reality? Are we simply representations and data? Are we, as I think it was Coleridge say, are we children without numbers, right? Are we of the paras, right? So why are we able to be in many places besides the apparent place, right? For me, this is a question I put in my notes, but for me, it's absolutely because of the imagination. The imagination could double as what Heidegger calls thinking. The imagination allows not only for us to imagine and create in a metaphysical imagination, essentially of things, but it also is I would say, a substrate of reality, of the actual reality, and is linked entirely to potential. So what is actual reality is the potency of the imagination, and then this potency is witnessed in conscious thought as it evades us and constantly refreshes itself in this kind of infinite or absolute notion that it has. So what does it mean to attend to the exact place in the here and now, right? The exact place, in a way, in the reading of Heidegger, the exact place is the potential ongoing multiple places at one time, analogously, loosely to a kind of multiverse, right? Maybe not as explicit, but Heidegger is giving us this sense, right? So it's a question of what Heidegger calls the stay among things, right? Which is a substrate of actual reality, right? So in a general Aristotelian concept or distinction between potential and actual, right? the stay among things is a kind of potent reserve in a way, which gets expressed through locales, right? In which they themselves are classified as things. So it gets very confusing because things are permitted, as Heidegger remarks on 356, right? They are codependent or correlated to locales, but you cannot really have that locale, which is a worldly kind of experience of spacing in a way, right? You cannot have that without the thing which is of a stay, right? So they're correlated, potency and the actual, but my interest then is the stay among things and this dimension of mind, which is not necessarily exhausted in the world, not entirely defined, right? And for Heidegger, this is essential, that if building and dwelling are correlated in a worldly sense, it's because there is another correlation between the potential and actual, the stay among things, and locales, which are as things as well. It's complicated. Again, this text takes time to work through and read. Okay, so when locales, by locales here, they co-govern. This is my phrasing, but they sort of co-govern this relationship between bridging and abridgment, right? I'm working with bridging and abridgment here in a different way. Okay, a bridge is a passage between two places, right? Over the river of infinite time, if you will, right? But when it is abridged, it is collapsing, right? Collapsing to the one point or the other, which the bridge in a way allows, right? And so the locale is a sort of domain at which these traversals can happen. It is passages in poetry which pass from the absolute into the worldly manifold of the written poem, or which the content of the poem retains this thinking that can never be exhausted, right? And Heidegger is encountering this with this bridge, but it's just, what about the abridgment? The abridgment shows up as, I'm thinking of the old bridge in Heidelberg as a mental representation, but I'm actually more there than I am here when I'm thinking, right? So this is the kind of fundamental character of human thinking that is fascinating, right? And he's really thinking pretty hard about this. He does not take it for granted, albeit he's working for philosophy quite intensively at the expense of what poetry is, or the experience of subjectivity according to poetry. So today, if we think of abridgments, right, what example could we have? Air travel. I can travel great distances, and that is a kind of moving at a great speed, which brings me into another place, another type of reality. But I might still be somewhere else, right? I might still be thinking somewhere else. And this is also a kind of confusion in modern day life, right? When we think of it, time, right? Our personal time, or our concept of time, is often embraced as money, right? And then technology changes how we make use of time, therefore how we use money. And I think one point here is that if we think about technology, money, and time, what Heidegger leaves us with is that our mind, our ability to think, is of something much greater than what technology reveals about places, okay? What technology reveals about money and our values, right? He wants us to attend to and dwell in places with this ability to, this human ability to traverse and abridge the sort of actual thing in front of us, right? And that's just one kind of way to read and interpret and bring out in a very complicated text, later Heidegger text. Okay, so here's then a little more focused recap. 356, 357, and 358. On 356, Heidegger is talking about the name he gives to a relation at the level of the state among things, okay? So as I had mentioned earlier, it is different than conscious reflections or representations of the bridge. This is a thinking that allows the passages of things of which we stay with. Yet these things require locales. So on 356, we should remember how he's defining that, right? So at the top, before the bridge stands, there are, of course, many spots along the stream that can be occupied by something. One of them proves to be a locale and does so because of the bridge. So the bridge has a special ability, right, and grants this to locales. Thus, the bridge does not first come to a locale to stand in it. Rather, a locale comes into existence only by virtue of the bridge. The bridge is a thing. It gathers the fourfold, but in such a way that it allows a site for the fourfold. By this site are determined the places and paths by which a space is provided for. So in order for a space to be legible, the thing has this relationship with a locale, and it is sort of illuminated in a way. And therefore the space is this by this site, right, are determined the places and paths by which a space is provided for. So space is sort of contingent on this passing through the peros, the limit, and it is individually opened, and it is unique in each incarnation to conscious thought. Now he continues in the second paragraph. Only things that are locales in this manner allow for spaces. So things that are locales can allow for spaces. So they have to have a special property. And, you know, part of me wants to kind of scribble on this a bit and say, well, does it have to be a bridge? Couldn't it be like a series of trees that one happens to notice, which creates a generative sort of, has a generative quality? Maybe there's a thingness about, you know, 4 or 5 trees and some bushes that create their own locale, right? But Heidegger, again, his concern is more of the anthropic, the dwelling, the human, the mortal, right? And so I would be confusing this a bit. I think it's worthy to sort of parallel out and say, well, why only things that are locales? Well, what are things that are locales? Why is it a bridge? I think the fact that it is a bridge here also is pressing on the illustrative quality of the image of a bridge, right? But I would think that if we wanted to delineate this, give this proof, why couldn't we talk about a series of trees that happen to be intensive and as a locale? If you've ever spent any time in the woods, hunting or scouting or doing things like this, you might have a good understanding of what I mean. Sometimes places just appear as a locale, intensive, and for no apparent reason. And I think this happens in life as well. So I do think there is some kind of, I'm trying to relate to Heidegger's locale in my own personal experience. It can be difficult, but I don't want this to be too exotic from the listener's thought here, that somehow locales have never occurred to them. I think one test of it is to consider, if you've ever been to a place, does it have a haunting quality? Is it a bit uncanny? Does it look a little bit larger than it really is? You know, when you're a kid, things are really big. Then you get older, they're small. That might not be exactly what we're talking about here. It could be. It could just be a physical sort of relationship, less the mental one in that way. But this is where Heidegger, okay, second paragraph, 356, my goal here was to talk about the relationship between thing, locale, and space. You can't have a locale without a thing. The bridge is a thing, and that allows places and paths which are related to a space, right? A space is generative of a space is made possible by the thing which is individuating into a locale as a space, right? Okay, then he goes into Raum, and then he starts talking about Peras and Horismos. And the boundary, right? Space in its essence that is let into the bounds, right? Okay. The next part here was, he then develops on locale and space, 357, okay? And that he's talking about locale and space, and then human beings and space, or man and space, as he says it. What is the relationship between locale and space and man and space? So this is a kind of description of the manifold character of the actual world. So from the potency of thing and the stay among things, the substrate, right? The restlessness of a kind of less than positive, a negativity, not negativity in that sense, but the negative, the non-actual, the pre-metaphysical domain of imagination, unadulterated mind, right? Locale and space and man and space, we're talking here about the actual world, right? So once more, the stay among things allows this actual world a type of constancy, the appearance of constancy, its consistency, right? But the shape of the world and its constancy is like being refreshed at any given rate of time by thinking in abridgments, right? Which are, of course, sourced from this kind of negative, the unadulterated. So then on 358, when Heidegger is elaborating on human beings and space, he emphasizes mortals in his thinking of space, right? And this causes his kind of emphasis on inhering, right? Which goes through 359. That in the bottom of 359, man's relation to locales and through locales to spaces inheres in his dwelling. The relationship between man and space is none other than dwelling thought, essentially. So it's it's essentially that we conceive of this human beings in space as dwelling, right? He then says, when we think in the manner just attempted about the relationship between locale and space, but also about the relation of man and space, a light falls on the essence of the things that are locales that we call buildings. So in a way, you have this kind of story, okay? This story of a sort of imperceptible felt thing which passes into a certain area. This certain area has a particular intensity, and then we have a relationship to this relationship between thing and locale, and that relationship is a type of space, right? And then as we realize and enter into this space, as we were relating to it, right, we're dwelling. So dwelling is being with this thinking, but also the thought of it, right? And so this is imitated in conscious thought, this relation, right? But now we understand buildings. We're also building the relation. We're building the relation that is already persisting through thing and locale, which is made available through the space, which is being built through thought, right? And this is why it's essentially that the relationship between man and space is none other than dwelling thought, essentially, right? And this is what leads to buildings. Okay. And so he says on 360 at the top, where we concluded last, the bridge is a thing of this sort. The bridge is a thing of this sort. The locale allows the simple onefold of earth and sky, of divinities and mortals, to enter into a site by arranging the site into spaces. So if we want to think about this, the world in which we live in, the public square, let's say, right? We enter into a space which arranges a site into spaces, right? And that the locale, it has a special ability to make room, establish more room. So this is a kind of building. The locale is now building in a way because it admits and installs the fourfold. Heidegger's fourfold's a bit awkward for me, but I'm trying. Okay, so let's continue. The two, making room in the sense of admitting and in the sense of installing, belong together as a double space making. The locale is a shelter for the fourfold, or by the same token, a house of being, I guess. Things as such locale shelter or house men's lives, and things of this sort are housings, though not necessarily dwelling houses in the narrower sense. The making of such things is building, as I had said, right? Now, what is being implied here is a double space making the locale as a shelter for the fourfold. The locale is protecting the fourfold, or distributing, co-governing the fourfold, which things have a special relationship with, right? It is co-governing in the sense that the imagination is also disclosed by a poem. The imagination can be disclosed by a thing that is a bridge, a special intensive place, a collection of trees, let's say, that are intensive. And that by protecting it, it's allowing its distribution, right? And this has a kind of ethical dimension to it. Human beings witness this in their dwelling. Dwelling is this building of it as well, this building of a kind of ethics or care, right? And I am already struck with, Heidegger's criticism of humanism here, and a kind of de-anthropocentric understanding of what it means to live somewhere, which is constantly pervasive, passing through different locales, and having a relationship to these locales, and taking care of these locales, not necessarily governing in the instrumental sense of governing in the oikonomia or the economy, in governing entirely by some elected government, but the governing that is of the things there, right, that are protecting and distributing through something, which is far more pervasive, which we are connected to, thinking, right, which is a passaging, allowing us to occupy and be with places, multiple places at one time, wherever we are, right? I am with the bridge. I love and protect the bridge by being where I am in another locale. I'm still in relation to it. I'm in multiple locales at once. This is my city. This is my village. This is my countryside, right? This is what allows me to have I'm building a relationship through these locales. We have spaces as such, and this is what it means to dwell, distributed. But the actual governing of it, right, is contingent on these. In a way, the sacredness of a bridge is the fact that it governs the fourfold, and that the fourfold is doubled, meaning there is a kind of potential fourfold, and then there's an actual fourfold, right, which is in the world, and which makes our dwelling places special. It's quite fascinating when we take a week, take a break from it, then come back and look at it. It's a fascinating iteration that could be built out of here. At any rate, let's continue. So Heidegger continues on with the making of such. He says the making of such things is building of houses in a way, right? And he's talking about the character of these things. I think I already sort of iterated that that these locales allow spaces. And he says this is why building concerns constructing locales, and that it founds and joins spaces, right? So we're joining spaces, and building, by paying attention to, is a kind of constructing a relationship with a place that is unique, that is governing the sort of sacral sort of relationship we have to the mind and the imagination. That's how I'm going to interpret it. That there is a protection going on here, and that this is allowing us to build this protection in the places that we inhabit. There really here is a way to sort of have reverence for the planet in which we live on, the environs, right? In the ecological sense as well. There is a kind of non-anthropocentric ethics here, which nonetheless benefits us in a sort of anthropic sense, that we have the special ability to recognize this, but it's not entirely full-throated humanism in the way that, and I suppose we're going to have to read that too, the letter on humanism. At any rate, he goes back into spatium and extensio, right? That because building produces locales, building, okay, in the special way we've defined it, the joining of the spaces of these locales necessarily brings with it space as spatium and as extensio into the thingly structure of buildings. The thingly structure of buildings. So, in describing the thingness of the building, and thingly, the way to describe it here, the thingness, right? Because building never shapes pure space, as Heidegger says, neither directly nor indirectly. Building does not shape pure space. Remember, space is problematic because we don't really know what space is. Earlier in Heidegger, in the last video, I confront that. Neither directly nor indirectly, nevertheless, because it produces things as locales, building is closer to the essence of spaces and to the essential origins of space than any geometry and mathematics. Finally, right, where we began here with philosophy's primacy, Heidegger has fully brought this to bear, and he's done it through the energy of poetry. Okay, so what is going on here? You know, the thingly structure of buildings, right? It thingly is more analogous to its constancy, its shaping. It's constantly vibing in a way, has its own refreshment of its thingness, right? But this kind of emergent, this actual appearance, right, is thingly because it is of something, of a substrate, right? But it does not shape pure space, neither directly nor indirectly, because it produces things as locales. The building is closer to the essence of spaces and to the essential origins of space than any geometry or mathematics, right? Right, because that's the purely abstract. And when we're dealing more closely with it, when we're dealing more intensively with the purely abstract, we are getting closer to arguments about the substrate and how the substrate emerges, right? Paras, horismos, again, being the out of which something emerges and is individuated, right? Building puts up locales that make space and a site for the fourfold. So, from the simple oneness in which earth and sky, divinities and mortals belong together, Building receives a directive for its erecting of locales. Building takes over from the fourfold the standard for all the traversing and measuring of the spaces that in each case are provided for by the locales that have been founded. So buildings are contingent upon locales. They do make a claim on space, but do not shape pure space, nonetheless have an interrelation. And then he's talking about the edifices guarding the fourfold. We can think of perhaps some of the decoration, perhaps, or the shape of the support beams having guiding energy or we can think of the feng shui in a very general sense, right? Then he says, look, building takes over from the fourfold the standard for all the traversing and measuring of the spaces that in each case are provided for by the locales that have been founded. The locales that have been founded then erect structures that are thingly buildings which relate to space. The edifices guard the fourfold. They are things that in their own way preserve the fourfold. To preserve the fourfold, to save the earth, to receive the sky, to await the divinities, to initiate mortals. This fourfold preserving is the simple essence of dwelling. In this way, then, do genuine buildings give form to dwelling in its essence. And how is this essential unfolding? Housing the unfolding of the doubled fourfold and then distributing it. So this is a kind of ground up distribution of a negative permeation, a pervasive type of thinking which is being established in erecting edifices and structures which are capturing space. You have this manifoldly actual world unfolding, which is intoned, let's say, by something of an infinite or absolute notion. Okay, we're at the bottom of 360. Building thus characterized is the distinctive letting dwell. Whenever it is such, in fact, building already has responded to the summons of the fourfold. All planning remains grounded on this responding, and planning in turn opens up to the designer the precincts suitable for his designs. Interesting here that, of course, the designer has to have precincts suitable for his designs. I like that. But the difference between, an artist and a designer is not that one is better than the other. It's just from which point do they begin? An artist begins from the point of confusion. And if they begin from the point of confusion, it's because they are closer to the substrate of potential at which they receive the notion and then the impulse to act. And at some point, when the artist as such, properly artist, is working, they have to have technical skill in order to design what has been put on the canvas, which is to work with what of a negative substrate has been allowed to paras, into its individual underpainting or basic expression. That's why artists act at that point, but they must also be a designer. Even Rothko has to be a designer, right? Okay. All planning remains grounded on a responding, right? That this building has responded to the summons of the fourfold, meaning it is somehow more potency than actual. All planning remains grounded on this responding to the perturbance, what's passing from the substrate, and planning in turn opens up to the designer the precincts suitable for his designs. And then he says, look, as soon as we try to think of the essence of constructive building in terms of a letting dwell, we come to know more clearly what that process of making consists in by which building is accomplished. Usually we take production to be an activity whose performance has a result, the finished structure, and its consequence. It is possible to conceive of making in that way. We thereby grasp something that is correct and yet never touch its essence, which is a producing that brings something forth. Right. This is important implicit criticism here. Why do you build something? You can ask all of the ghost cities in modern day China, why were those built? Why are things built? Because they have an idea, they have a value, right? We only make things that have economic value. I mean, I think you can take Heidegger's criticism from here, right? Usually we take production to be an activity whose performance has a result, the finished structure, and its consequence. It is possible to conceive of making in that way. We thereby grasp something that is correct and yet never touch its essence. What is the essence of those ghost cities? What is the finished structure's consequence? Well, number one, they're usually not finished. What is its consequence? Right? It's interesting. I think I'm mobilizing this because I want to be able to deploy Heidegger's thought into a way of understanding a city, or what it means to live in a city. Oh, I can go to Chinatown. Oh, I can go to Little Italy. Oh, I can go. Those are not necessarily locales in their general category. They are parts of a city, but this thinking about multiple locales working together, right? That is the city, right? And why do they exist? Why are they there, right? What are their essence? Is the essence only what it means to be an Italian, right? Or Mexican or Chinese? I think Heidegger is reaching beyond that cultural framework here. And that I think as we evolve with our technologies, we come to respect and revere and harness more of the energies of nature. We realize that the essence is tied more closely to that, right? And that there's something here that we need to keep in touch with, right? It's not just designing it, okay? It's not just building properties so we can invest in them and make money, although that's part of it. Okay, so I've gone on a little tangent there. It is possible to conceive of making in that way where we thereby grasp something that is correct and yet never touch its essence, which is a producing that brings something forth, right? We connect, right? We grasp something that is correct, yet never touch its essence, which is a producing that brings something forth. For building brings the fourfold hither into a thing, the bridge, and brings forth the thing as a locale, out into what is already present, room, for which is only now made by this locale. Room is made by the locale. Okay. That's the top of 361. Let's work back here with on 361, but let's keep in mind that the designer, the artist, the art, which is the result of a designer, okay, could be that a well-designed place understands space insofar as they are as where the artist begins. It's such a wonderful and uncanny experience to be in that place. The designer in some way is backwards to the pure potency that the artist starts from, but this is no different than the relationship between science and art, whereby art is impelled, science converges, right? Art branches out divergently, after which there's multiple possibilities. Potential is shown in the actual, with a favorable weight to the potential. Science says, but we observe this, let's reduce it into a concept. And this is the general antinomy here of worldly things: expression and reduction, divergence and convergence. In the forms of logic, the three forms of logic, which give way to the fourth, and so forth. Okay, so Heidegger then is going to talk about techne. Okay, he says, he's talking about this word tikto, the Greek word, to bring forth or to produce. The word techne, technique, belongs to the verb's root tech. To the Greeks, techne means neither art nor handicraft, but rather to make something appear with what is present, as this or that, in this way or that way. The Greeks conceive of techne, producing, in terms of letting appear. Techne, thus conceived, has been concealed in the tectonics of architecture since ancient times. Of late, it still remains concealed, and more resolutely, in the technology of power machinery. But the essence of the erecting of buildings cannot be understood adequately in terms either of architecture or of engineering construction, nor in terms of a mere combination of the two. The erecting of buildings would not be suitably defined even if we were to think of it in the sense of the original Greek techne as solely a letting appear, which brings something made as something present among the things that are already present. Did you get that? Techne, letting appear, right? It's essentially related to architecture as he defines it, right? Let's read on. I've gone on a lot of tangents here. The essence of building is letting dwell. Building accomplishes its essential process in the raising of locales by the joining of their spaces. Only if we are capable of dwelling, only then can we build. Let us think for a while of a farmhouse in the Black Forest, which was built some 200 years ago by the dwelling of peasants. Here, the self-sufficiency of the power to let earth and sky, divinities and mortals enter into simple oneness, into things, ordered the house. Okay, I'm on the top of 362. This is kind of curious. Here, the self-sufficiency of the power to let earth and sky, divinities and mortals enter into simple oneness, into things, ordered the house. Very confusing sentence. What? At first, anyway. What is self-sufficiency of the power to let? Self-sufficiency of the power to let earth, sky, divinities, mortals. Let's see. Let's read on. It placed the farm on the wind-sheltered mountain slope, looking south among the meadows close to the spring. It gave it the wide overhanging shingle roof whose proper slope bears up under the burden of snow, and that reaching deep down shields the chambers against the storms of the long winter nights. It did not forget the altar corner behind the community table. It made room in its chamber for the hallowed places of childbed and the tree of the dead, for that is what they call a coffin there, the Totenbaum. And in this way it designed for the different generations under one roof the character of their journey through time. A craft that itself sprung from dwelling still uses its tools and its gear as things built the farmhouse. So it's still building, no? This is actually quite a potent paragraph, because we go back into the same type of rhetorical movement of the first describing the old bridge at Heidelberg before it was named. Here, this place is named and then described. Interesting. Traversal. So this German farmhouse, I'm assuming, right? Black Forest. It has these kind of components, and it is designed for the different generations under one roof, the character of their journey through time. It is very much historical, materialistic sort of understanding, right, etches into the material things of the passages of mortals and their relationship to sky, to divinities, and so forth, right? At which we participate in its governance of the fourfold as a locale, right? And that's why we see this a craft that has sprung up from dwelling, that still uses its tool and its gear as things built the farmhouse, right? This building and this dwelling is a kind of gear. What a strange way to describe it, as a kind of churning out from a node in time, in the sense of this paras, this individuation, this thingliness now of this occupancy of observation, and in really the let's say somewhat psychedelic experience of reading this particular passages, that I kind of feel there too. I kind of feel like I'm there too, right? I kind of feel like I'm standing in this place. And the happy accident is in my interpretation of the text, and not the purely defined eidetic version of the actual photo. Its thingliness is more vibrant to me because I'm reading it, right? I'm imagining it. And its individuation continues in space and time in the world, and that's a work of the imagination. Like the bridge in Heidelberg, I'm actually really in this place that Heidegger is talking about. I'm closer to it than this chair and desk at which I sit at, but now I guess I'm here. Nonetheless, I think you get the illustration. And this is why it's important to read, and then read good text, and commit to texts that are difficult. And it's times like these where the poetic prose is strong, and it's a reward. Now, if we want to take our foregrounding and be mad at Heidegger because he was a German and whatever, and go ahead and with your polemics and your politics, that's fine. You have a right to have those, work through them, and intend responsibility to why you do. But I just happen to really enjoy this part here. And it's not the charm of the rhetoric. It's good text. Okay, we're in the middle of 362, and this is almost it here, right? He continues on. Only if we are capable of dwelling, only then can we build. Our reference to the Black Forest farm in no way means that we should or could go back to building such houses. Rather, it illustrates by a dwelling that has been how it was able to build. Okay, read it again. Only if we are capable of dwelling, only then can we build. Our reference to the Black Forest farm in no way means that we should or could go back to building such houses. Rather, it illustrates by a dwelling that has been how it was able to build. Okay, Heidegger is saying, look, I know what you're going to say. I'm a romantic. I'm not saying that. I think he does evaluate that and appreciate it in its sort of German qualities. But again, he's like, look, this is how a dwelling has been and how it was able to build. That's a really important point. So when we look at the structures of the past, we do see the connection between divinities, sky, right, mortals, right, and earth. And we see that this gear is turned out, this structure, this shape, and it has a thingliness, and it's strong, it can be potent. But we recover from it not the cultural milieu. That's important, but it's not really what's going on here. And I alluded to that a little bit ago, right? Whether you're in Chinatown, Little Italy, whatever, there is something more here that we ascertain. And this is what allows human beings, in an anti sort of humanist anthropic perspective, that nothing is not the point, the Copernican nothing, that there is something here to be learned. It has been, but it's also how it was able to build. And we need to understand that the things we occupy and create and inhabit are very important, especially if we're inhabiting technology, with a part of our mental, our minds are in this kind of dwelling in these buildings of social media, right? And that also the things at which we live on are linked to this technology, right? We really have to be able to think about the magnitude of abridgments that go on all the time, and that there is a kind of digital inhabiting, right? A kind of carving out of, not of the Totenbaum, but it could be a Totenbaum of our digital footprint, right? A whole history of ourselves dwelling in data, and how that's read and how that's being built by natural language processing, right? By AI, and how it's attaining perhaps its own intelligence, right? Its own general capacities to build. Because what Heidegger is showing you here is that, yeah, this gear moves this out, and though these people have passed, it still reminds us of this opening and establishing. And that technology will also take on this characteristic. But the difference is, perhaps in Heidegger's fourfold, the technology becomes a divinity to some. Okay, I'm going off again, being divergent, but I'm feeling very strong with this text now. I'm feeling very comfortable to make these connections. So, the middle of 362. Dwelling, however, is the basic character of being, in keeping with which mortals exist. Perhaps this attempt to think about dwelling and building will bring out somewhat more clearly that building belongs to dwelling, and how it receives its essence from dwelling. Enough will have been gained if dwelling and building have become worthy of questioning, and thus have remained worthy of thought. I think we've just done that. I've questioned it in terms of social media, in terms of AI, AGI, making those relationships to what kind of things are we inhabiting, and why, if we're inhabiting technology more than the actual places, the public space in the open, in the analog open, are we staying with things? Are we staying with things? Are we inhabiting the earth well? Are we abandoning earth? Is this the first sign of our migration or our extinction? All of things that are subject to nature, in which human beings are not greater than, have been subject to extinction events. We know this, right? Okay, but Heidegger continues, but that thinking itself belongs to dwelling in the same sense as building, although in a different way, may perhaps be attested to by the course of thought here attempted. Building and thinking are, each in its own way, inescapable for dwelling. The two, however, are also insufficient for dwelling, so long as each busies itself with its own affairs in separation, instead of listening to the other. So building, thinking, dwelling, listening, right? They are able to listen if both building and thinking belong to dwelling. If they remain within their limits and realize that the one, as much as the other, comes from the workshop of long experience and incessant practice. So his insistence, as we round out 362 there, his insistence is, right, building and thinking belong to dwelling. And dwelling, right, is this more like the mediative sort of between the emergence of something, right, and its organization. Okay, building and thinking is like this unadulterated emergence at which building takes the divergence of the thinking and converges it into something which retains and shelters thinking. And if we know how to dwell, which is of course interrelated, correlated, then we're going to be fine. But this is an incessant practice. Okay, 363, 2 paragraphs left. We are attempting to trace in thought the essence of dwelling. The next step on this path would be the question, what is the state of dwelling in our precarious age? It's still a relevant question, right? We're trying to go to other planets, apparently, in that worldly sense. On all sides, we hear talk about the housing shortage, and with good reason. What's changed, right? Nor is there just talk, there is action too. We try to fill the need by providing houses, by promoting the building of houses, planning the whole architectural enterprise. However hard and bitter, however hampering and threatening the lack of houses remains, the proper plight of dwelling does not lie merely in a lack of housing. The proper plight of dwelling is indeed older than the world wars with their destruction, older also than the increase of the earth's population and the condition of the industrial workers. The proper dwelling plight lies in this, that mortals ever search anew for the essence of dwelling, that they must ever learn to dwell. So I suppose, because I had mentioned the ghost cities of China, that is also a housing crisis, just not a shortage. It's a question of dwelling, from Heidegger's perspective, brought into the contemporary. Continues Heidegger, what if man's homelessness consisted in this, that man still does not even think of the proper plight of dwelling as the plight? Do we know how to live on the earth? Do we know this is our plight? Continues Heidegger. Yet as soon as man gives thought to his homelessness, it is a misery no longer. Rightly considered and kept well in mind, it is the soul summons that calls mortals into their dwellings. A soul summons. But how else can mortals answer this summons than by trying on their part, on their own, to bring dwelling to the fullness of its essence? This they accomplish when they build out of dwelling and think for the sake of dwelling. There it is. Think for the sake of dwelling. How do you dwell in Twitter? How do you dwell in YouTube? How do you dwell wherever you are? Home is where you hang your hat, right? But it's a little bit more than that, isn't it? Home is where you have perhaps not even been yet. In fact, you have not been yet. Home can be found in reading a text, in the habitus, so to speak. We could be in multiple different locales with intensive things that allow these locales and allow space in the buildings which govern with the locale, the guarding of the fourfold, and distribute it and protect it. But we must dwell with that. We must dwell in places that we have not been yet, in this physical, very, very physical, tacit way. A lot to think about here. But no summary now. I've summarized enough, pontificated enough. And I think that's it. Until next time, until perhaps a letter on humanism.